Hello, my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel, Springboard Thought. Today I'm doing weekly reads, weekly review. I read 8 books, I think it is, but one was a DNF. Another surprising one, just like last week. So we'll get into it. It should be a pretty quick wrap up with so few books. So first I read The Kingdoms by Natasha Pulley. And this was a very interesting book. When I looked at other reviews to compare after I had solidified my own thoughts, I found that this author's like a lot more popular than I thought. This was like a complete shot in the dark for me. I'm pretty sure it was on sale Black Friday at Book Outlet, and it just seemed kind of interesting. But apparently a whole bunch of her other books are also very good, so I'll check it out after this. This I gave 4 stars, exceeded expectations. It's very hard to talk about without giving away sort of the meat and the heart of the thing. It's about a man who has amnesia, receives a postcard or a letter in the mail from 100 years ago, I believe it was, to come home if he remembers. A lot of this book ends up taking place sailing on a boat, which for some people will be like catnip. For me, it was rather the opposite. I like the idea of sailing without the granularity of knowing every aspect about it, which is why I have avoided those Master and Commander books, even though they're so lauded. But this is also about time travel, about history, about who gets to shape history, what that does to contextualize history, as well as playing with memory. And it has quite, at some points anyway, queer themes, queer characters. It's very concerned with constructing characters with contradictions, which will be for people and not again. There is some very interesting decisions that occur with characters where it feels like it's like a Southpaw Sidewinder kind of deal, but I came to see that all of the characters kind of had that kind of contradiction where under certain circumstances they would completely make decisions that you were surprised by as a reader, which feels pretty true to life for me. I tend to like characters like that, so it didn't bother me. That seems to have sunk the book for some people, but as long as I think you go into this with an open mind and don't particularly look for historical fiction or sci-fi particular genre conventions, I think it'll be a pleasant surprise. A lot of people describe this as a fun book to read if you just let go, and I think I would agree with that. I think I would even reread this book knowing the ending without saying anything, and it might even go up to like a 5-star read at that point. A Ghost in the Throat. This book was absolutely fantastic. I gave it 5 stars. I listened to it on audio as well as reading it, not dual but alternating. Fantastic stuff. Where to even begin with this? So first of all, I believe she's a poet. You can tell it's a poet sensibilities here. Like, there is some passages concerned with musicality and lyricism, but that's kind of my jam. That's what I'm into. I would prefer that over meat and potatoes prose, basically, or contemporary Hemingway stuff, not at his best, but mimicked or aped. This is, as a result, feels very indicative of the person writing it. It feels very personal. There's a lot of savagely honest and earnest communication about motherhood, about personal thoughts towards other people. It's just one of those very like raw memoirs. It is about a woman who we follow kind of like living an alternate life than she had expected, why she finds herself in motherhood, what she finds nourishing about nourishing other people, as well as kind of contemplating a life not chosen or gone down, as she discovers more writings on a very particular Irish poem that is a classic that I wasn't aware of. And she endeavors to translate it herself. And in so doing so, she sort of like enters a rabbit hole where she tries to figure out what happened to this woman, her family, trace the lineage, really just sort of spiral out there, and then contextualizes that with what was happening in her life. And at the end of the book, you get her actual translation. It's fantastically structured. It is sometimes non-linear in its structure, which will bother some people, but I tend to like in memoirs. She knows what is interesting, at least to me, and endeavors to go there all the time. I will say parts of this book were 4 stars, but the highs were just so high that I gave it a 5-star anyway. So if you wanted to get granular, it'd probably be like a 4.75 or a 4.5 rounded up. Next, I read Checkout 19, which was a library book, and I returned. And this is by Claire-Louise Bennett. This was something that I really expected and have been expecting for like a year, but I DNF'd it. And this was another, like, didn't get along with the prose and the point of view and the structure that was going on. I found the voice extremely annoying. It had mannerisms that kept repeating itself, and just wasn't getting to anywhere interesting in the first like 15-20 pages. Usually I try to give a book 50 pages, but the voice was so annoying that I just didn't want to proceed. It sounded like childlike, kind of like sarcastic. Again, a pet peeve of mine is when a writer uses sort of dialogue that is supposed to be like diegetic, but isn't. Like, it doesn't feel organic and signals itself out all of the time as being frustrating. It's why dialogue isn't written like people actually speaking real life. So, but I'll have more to say on that later, actually, as one of the books I'm reading right now does do dialogue kind of like that and actually pulls it off. So I think there's some craft work at play as well there. But so didn't rate it, put it down. Next, I did the audiobook of The Devotion of Suspect X, and this was a 2.5 stars rounded up to 3. This was a unconventional commercial fiction-y, at least the way that I read it, book about a woman who is being stalked by her ex. It's in Japan, and so she doesn't, there's like a lot of internalized misogyny. She doesn't feel like the police would back her up, even more so than in Western culture. They would side with the man over her. She's taken a lot of steps to be divorced and moved around a lot to kind of shake him, but he's sort of back on her trail again. When things devolve in an altercation, the man is murdered, and there's a conspiracy between her and this complete stranger of a neighbor of hers to cover up the crime. We then go into the how to get away with it portion of the book, I guess, where right off the bat these things occur, and more or less you're trying to figure out which between the detective, the woman, and this suspect X guy, I guess, the next door neighbor, who appears to be like a hyper intelligent, I think it's a mathematician who went to the Imperial Academy, which is apparently very prestigious. And the detective on the case also did that. Another minor character is a friend of both of theirs from this academy, who I can't remember what, he's a professor of some kind. And basically the book proceeds in a very plodding way. The pacing is very slow, and it essentially just unwinds into a cat and mouse type game of these kind of hyper intelligent people trying to get away with things. The annoying thing about that is that the victim, in this case the woman who was assaulted by her ex-husband, is almost like beside the point. Like, she's the focal point without having any agency whatsoever, more or less, throughout it. And the larger machinations are through the men, which I felt was a strange point of view shift and less interesting. We know very little about all of the characters. It's like cardboard cutout time and completely plot driven, based on a hinges on a twist near the end, which did work for me, which is why it got a 2.5 and not a 2 and rounded up. Next, I read These Precious Days and Patchett's memoir from last year. I think it got nominated onto a prize recently, and well deserved. I gave it 4 stars. This is a memoir, again, a kind of like ruthlessly endearing, completely raw, honest thing, where she goes on about not wanting kids and just being like a contrarian in some ways, but it's a set of essays, so the topic shifts quite a bit, but it is held together quite nicely by the themes running throughout it, which was a nice surprise. However, this book did again have like high points at a 5 and low points at a 4, but there was 2 or 3 stories that were of less interest to me, and so it was not rounded up to a 5, though it was close to it. And so like a 4.25 or 4.5 rounded down instead of up. The talk about like fiction saving her life, her friends' lives, and sort of the inextricable sort of enmeshing, I guess, of fiction with her life, as well as how her memories contextualize it, and her almost like robbing her own grave when she discovers, or is presented with basically by her mother, of her old stories and different people contacting her, sometimes completely out of the blue, about her previous writing that she has really no recollection of. It's like rediscovering herself. It is really cohesive and meaty and interesting, and she writes very well, so I liked it a lot. I think it's something you could consume without having to really appreciate Ann Patchett's work, but if you did, you'd take away more from it. Like, she talks about the Dutch house, she talks about the importance of covers, cover design, and sort of like a little bit of insider baseball, I guess, with publishers. Really, it covers a really wide gamut of stuff, and starts off very strong, but thankfully it's not one of those collections where it's like the first story and the last story are the best to try to like trick the reader into having like a positive experience. I would say it's completely strong throughout, with, as I said, just a personal connection thing with me, with 2 or 3 of the stories feeling like a little bit of a meandering. I could see why it was connected, but they just weren't as fleshed out and meaty as some of the stories, so I just couldn't quite get it to the 5-star for me. Reptile Memoirs, and this is a arc that comes out 17th of March, so quite soon. This is translated fiction, obviously. I don't think, for some reason, it even mentioned who the translator was on Goodreads or within this book, which is strange. It is a uncorrected proof. Oh, there it is. It's Alison McCullough. So there we go. This is essentially a book that you need to watch out for the blurb with, because it says that it is for readers of Gillian Flynn, literary thrillers, Joe Nesbo, who I hadn't heard of, but seems like he's quite popular, and Tana French. So this sets up pretty high expectations for me. I can kind of see those ingredients somewhat within the story, but pivotally what was lacking is the prose work, matching Tana French and Gillian Flynn. Gillian Flynn is like, almost makes her books kind of like addictive to consume. She's sort of the master of pacing, doling out information, and kind of like using a pacing mechanic with the chapters and multiple point of view typically to really drive things forward. This book does do that thriller formula, but it reads very much like commercial fiction. It is a dual timeline, multiple point of view story. So I would say depending on whether you like that or not, me not so much. I saw it as a very slow paced. Other people rate it as very fast paced because you're going through, it feels like you're going through it, but not much is actually happening in the plot, which is typically what my brain pays attention to. This is a story about, in one timeline, a young girl goes missing. Her mother kind of plays out a problematic power fantasy, I guess, with a game of chicken with her daughter at a grocery store who's acting out. It seems like it's not very far away, like a 10-minute walk. So to teach her a lesson, she drives away, and she's got like clinical depression or something like that going on, maybe some mania, bipolar disorder stuff, not too sure. But she leaves, contemplates leaving her entire family the whole time, but she ends up going home. The kid is missing. They freak out, they call the cops, and the team that responds to these specific things, think like Law and Order, SVU, except Missing Kids Department, or the Dublin Murder Squad, which is maybe where they got that ingredient, except again, specifically Missing Kids is what it seems like. And then in the other timeline, there's a focus on a one point of view, typically from what I recall, a nursing student who develops a kind of unhealthy attachment to a snake, which is illegal, and they get illegally. She has two roommates. They kind of end up first sharing the snake, but because it needs to stay in her room because they leave their doors open all the time and it would be taken away or maybe killed or something if discovered, she ends up spending all of her time with it. She has deep-seated trauma issues. She feels a little bit different than the other two roommates and kind of like imprints, I guess you could say, on the snake. And then there's also chapters from the actual snake's perspective, which was interesting, kind of weird, and sometimes worked, sometimes didn't. Her unhealthy attachment grows, and then these two timelines eventually converge in sometimes surprising, sometimes very predictable ways. This was sort of 3 stars for me, does exactly what it says it does on the tin, but no more. Again, expect contemporary upmarket or commercial fiction and not literary thriller, in my opinion. I would say some of the character work might be a little bit better. There's some, like the character work is a little bit better, but the prose work, I feel very bland. It got out of the way when it was at its best, kind of deal. So that could be like a translation thing. I'm not sure. But yeah, it was fine. And thanks a lot to Guilty Feet Daniels for sending me this. He got the arc initially, wasn't interested in it. I expressed interest, and he sent it to me to Canada, and I consumed it and thought it was fine. I thought it's definitely worth a read if you're into this thing and that sounds interesting to you. I think just beware the blurb, like I said. Next is Kindred by Octavia Butler. This needs no introduction, I'm sure. It's about a Black woman who, for no apparent reason, is pulled back into the past and discovers her kindred. She puts this all together quite quickly, actually. I liked the intelligence of the character, for one. And it's 30 years before the Civil War, I believe. And she has like time dilation, I think that's what it's called, where she experiences much more time in the past, and then when her life is threatened, she returns to the future, and over there it's been, moments, minutes, not much time at all. And what proceeds is like this pretty sprawling, surprisingly long kind of adventure slash devolution, I guess, where she like has to confront her past, has to confront some pretty troubling notions about herself, while also dealing with her view of her loved one, Henry, I think the guy's name was. I can't remember. He was fairly forgettable, apparently. But it raises a lot of interesting questions that are intersectional, that have no easy answers. It's very like good at describing moral, not ambiguity, but grays, I guess, in people. There's no black and white, even though you think it would be, because there's a lot to deal with slavery. She has to sort of integrate herself into the past, as well as living as a slave, as well as on a plantation. And she has to really come to terms with who her ancestors were, what her notions about them are, sort of how they elucidate certain aspects about herself, about her family, what they have internalized about their family, what they know about their family. Again, history, who gets to write history, and the context around it. It had a surprising ending, I think, to it. A very satisfying read, very brutal at times, which I hadn't expected, because the prose are very straightforward. I think they, again, kind of like do their job, get out of the way, but for some reason it felt kind of YA-ish to me. And so when the brutality and certain things started happening that I don't want to give away, it did feel surprisingly enunciated with the brutality, even though in some ways it might be very expected when you think about slavery, plantation, and kind of where the story is going. And that hit a very emotional mark for me. I can't say I enjoyed this book, but I thought it was well done. And I gave it 4 stars. It exceeded my expectations. The craft work wasn't there for it to be 5 stars, I think. It raises a lot more questions than it answers, but it definitely feels unique, and it definitely seems like, what's that movie with Janelle Monáe, I think it is? Antebellum. Must have been heavily inspired by this book. And yeah, I get the hype, and I think I have a couple more by Butler, so I'm looking forward to those. Then lastly, I consumed Satellite Love by Ferguson, Genki Ferguson. This was another hard book to talk about. The audiobook is well narrated. There's 3 narrators, I think, for each character, all very well done. And it effectively separates the narrative in a way that I think this could have gone way off the rails as an audiobook if it didn't. So that was nice. It's about a young girl with mental health issues who is living in Japan, I believe, yeah. And she is being bullied excessively. She has home life obligations that she really shouldn't have to deal with, but does anyway. Her family expect a lot of her. There's tons of pressure. She's ostracized. She doesn't feel like she belongs, and things spiral from there. It's hard to talk about without giving away some central conceits of this book that kind of make it pivotal in order to really get the most out of the plot, I think. But she has a very active imagination that begins to grow and supplant reality in some ways. Like, you could say it's a very surrealistic component to the story, except that married how it is to mental health, it's a liminal space that it is providing the reader, so you have to kind of figure it out yourself, or just ask yourself the question, and it does that very well. I think it's provocative in its way. It is very brutal at times, so if you're triggered by bullying or self-harm or things around that, I would probably give this a pass. But I think it's very nuanced and well handled as far as I can tell. I don't know that I could speak intelligently about how well it handles mental health stuff, so I would just say play it safe, and if you're at all thinking that you might be triggered, you probably will be by this book. That said, there is also a surrealistic component where her imagination becomes something that she can interact with and becomes like a physicality, and the more attention that she spends on these imaginations, they become more real, and then reality itself is questioned and sort of the lens and contextualization of reality become a component that is more and more interrogated by the story than the regular stuff that unfolds with the plot. So if you also don't like heavy plot stuff, you will not like this book. But if you like interiority and you can handle sort of the darkness that is here and the emotional components around mental health and self-harm, I think you could get a lot out of this book, and it definitely exceeded my expectations. I gave it 4 stars. It never really was in danger of reaching a 5-star mark, but it is solidly 4 stars, and I again enjoyed it. And then the only book that I'm currently reading is J.R. I am about 3/4 of the way through this now, and so it's hard to speak on because I guess I'll have to just give my impressions. I talked about this with Mark Nash. We're doing a buddy read, which has been phenomenal. He's noticed a lot of things that I didn't. There's a heavy cognitive load to this book because it is predominantly all dialogue, separated just with dashes. And occasionally there are sort of like run-on sentence descriptions that are almost always paragraphs that are like almost beatific, bucolic, very purple prose, but like incandescent within the nature of all this dialogue being discussed and articulated all of the time. The dialogue does a lot of the work because you have to figure out who is speaking, who is being addressed, what all has changed within the scene, because it will just, there's no breaks or anything like that. It's just continuous. And so it's harder for me to analyze the book, I found, going through it, even though the dialogue is so well written that the flow isn't the problem. It's the cognitive load of me populating everything that's going on, as well as it being so cinematic that I'm visualizing everything quite predominantly and projecting a lot into the scene in order to give it context in my head. And so I just wouldn't be paying attention to the craft work, but luckily Mark is, so it's been excellent to hear his thoughts on it. There's a lot of stuff that would be almost prophetic or speculative in this work, which is fascinating to me. I love it when like historical text becomes speculative or prophetic in that way, where they predict so much stuff in the future, especially with like the commodification of art, about computers and their role in society, about people, younger generations sort of like disassembling and assembling their personhood in order to like better fit society, basically. So you could think of it as like that first generation of millennials like me who had computers in their household and how like easy it was for us to pick it up and roll with it. And then now what people are like my brother's kids, my nieces, are very young, yet they can just like use cell phones from the age of like 2 or 3. They take selfies, they like pose for pictures with the family. They feel like they get stuff a lot easier, and yet there's this like wide gap that feels almost like troubling for an older generation. And this is well depicted in this book. There's a number of different characters, wide-ranging in age and gender, where the gaps are very like apparent, and it is very satirical. It interrogates the American dream, money, Wall Street, separation of class, stratification. There's a lot of stuff going on in this book. It's very meaty, as you might expect. And yeah, I find it excellent to consume, even as I know that I'm being less critical evaluating it. But them's the breaks. So far, I think I would put it at like a 4.5, sometimes rounding up, sometimes rounding down. And otherwise, I will see you next video. See you later.